I'm an indigenous person from the Philippines, but I'm working with UNDP consulting on climate change, indigenous peoples, and local communities. And together with me, who will be co-presenting, will be joining us virtually is Beth. Can you hear us, Beth? And can you give a brief introduction of yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much, Manja. First of all, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for having me virtually today. As Manja said, my name's Beth Eggerts, and I am a Gender and Red Plus Specialist with UNDP's Climate and Forest team within the Climate Hub. And just a quick background on my work under UN Red. I've been supporting UN Red for the last 10 years in helping the program mainstream gender into its work. So thanks so much, Manja. Back over to you.
Thank you. We'll be alternating in giving, in having this conversation with you this morning. So I would say it's more of a conversation than a presentation, so that we'll have an interactive discussion this morning. Can we have the next slide? Or do I have? Oh, sorry, I have this. Where do I? Put the press, the right, but it's not. Where do I should? Okay, there you go. Okay, so we'll just be having this. We'll have at the first part. We'll have a quiz. Let's see who gets the answers right, and then a brief background on social inclusion and gender concepts and the policy frameworks. And also we'll be answering the question: why is there a need to integrate social inclusion and gender perspective in Red Plus? Some of these topics we have been discussing actually in the past 2 days, but we'll go a little bit deeper today, although not much comprehensive because we only have like 2 days of this. Okay, so are we ready for the quiz? This is an interactive quiz. Okay, so this is the first question. Indigenous peoples make up how many percent of the global population, but protect how many percent of the world's remaining biodiversity? So letter A, it's 20% and 40%. Letter B, 40% and 50%. And letter C, 5% and 80%. Let's see who's, by raise of hands, who thinks the answer is letter A? No? 20% and 40% about online. You can also raise your hands online so that we can know your answers. Letter A? There's one at the back. There's 2. Letter B? 40% and 50%. No response? And then letter C, 5% and 80%. Okay, there's a lot of 5% and 80%. Okay. Next question about online. Did they respond? There's one. Okay, next question. Africa, which is the second largest continent and some of the oldest recorded civilization, has the biggest number of indigenous populations among all different cultural regions. Is this true or false? Is it true? Okay, 5 answers. Who says that if this is false? Five answers. The others are not decided. Okay. Okay, let's see. First, and then here's another one. Africa has the world's highest net loss of forest area at 3.9 million hectares per year. Is this true or false? Is it true? 9 people says it's true, and how many says this is false? True. Okay, so there's said 2 people said false, and the others I don't know. Okay, let's see. So there are estimated inclusion, but what do we really mean by social inclusion? Just to have like a common understanding when we talk about social inclusion, for discussion would be the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals, leaving no one behind framework, which is underpinned by a commitment to achieve respect for equality and non-discrimination, and to respect, promote, and protect human rights without distinction, regardless of race, religion, political affiliation, gender, or whatsoever. And so when we talk about social inclusion, we look at those who are usually excluded in society, the poorest, the most vulnerable, the marginalized sectors of society, which includes women, children, youth, persons with disability, persons living with HIV/AIDS, elderly persons, indigenous peoples, local communities, and so on. But for the purpose of our conversation here, we are focusing on indigenous peoples and affected local communities and women and children because of their crucial role in conserving natural resources and contributing to climate adaptation and mitigation, and the severity of impact of climate change on these groups. So for our discussion, we are focusing on the gender aspect, indigenous peoples, and the local communities. Someone was raising his hand earlier. Yes, please go ahead. That clarification. So there you go. Those are, when we're discussing social inclusion here, at least we're clear on what are the aspects that we are focusing on. It's not moving. And then next, let us also have like a common understanding of who indigenous peoples are. Considering the diversity of indigenous peoples worldwide, there is no official definition of who indigenous peoples are under the UN system. Instead, international legal regime has developed like an understanding of the term based on the following. We have the self-identification as indigenous peoples at the individual level, and this identification should be recognized by the community or by other people. And they have historical continuity with pre-colonial and pre-settler societies with very strong link to their territories and their surrounding natural environments. They have distinct social, economic, or political systems. They have distinct languages, culture, and beliefs. And they have a determination to preserve, develop, and transmit to future generations their ancestral territories and their identity as peoples in accordance with their own patterns, social institutions, and legal systems. So these are basic criteria that are being used usually to identify whether a group is indigenous or not. But the most important thing here is self-identification, that they identify themselves as indigenous peoples. And this set of criteria has been adopted actually in the African region. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights, on one of its earlier reports, underscored that indigenous peoples in Africa, while having different or distinct cultures, they face common challenges of marginalization and discrimination. And also, they are left on the margins of development. They are also commonly perceived negatively by the dominant mainstream development paradigms. Their cultures and lives are always or most of the time subject to discrimination and contempt. African peoples who are identifying as indigenous vary across various economic systems, and they embrace hunter-gatherers, pastoralists, small-scale farmers, and different rural groups. The hunter-gatherers, for example, who identify as indigenous peoples, they include the Pygmies of the Great Lakes region, the San of South Africa, the Hadzabe of Tanzania, Ogiek, Sengwer, and Yaku of Kenya. Examples of pastoralist communities who identify as indigenous peoples, these are the Pukot of Kenya and Uganda. We have the Barabaig of Tanzania and the Maasai of Kenya and Tanzania. These are some of the examples only. Are there any objection to the examples, or it's accepted that these people are self-identifying? Okay. Let's see. On the legal and policy framework for indigenous peoples, the rights of indigenous peoples have clear protection under international law. The main document that describes their rights is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This is highly endorsed by almost all of the countries in the world. All the countries who are represented here in the room today have endorsed this declaration. It is the most comprehensive instrument detailing the rights of indigenous peoples in international law and policy, and it contains the minimum standards for the recognition, protection, and promotion of indigenous peoples' rights. It includes important substantive rights, like the right to self-determination, the rights to land, territories, and resources, and the economic, social, and cultural rights, collective rights, and the equality and non-discrimination. And while the declaration under international law technically is not a binding treaty, it contains rights and freedoms that are set out in binding international human rights instruments or treaties, of which are considered customary law. This includes the core international human rights instruments, like the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and so on. And also other treaties and conventions. For example, we have ILO 169, which is a binding treaty, and it covers indigenous people's right to development, and it recognizes their customary laws and their rights to land, territories, and resources. ILO Convention 169, while it is a positive law for indigenous peoples, only one country in Africa ratified this convention. That's the Central African Republic. Most of the countries that ratified this convention are from the Latin American region. And then we have the Convention on Biological Diversity, especially Article 8, which addresses the knowledge, innovations, and practices of indigenous and local communities. So it recognizes the traditional lifestyles, it recognizes the traditional knowledge and the practices that they bring into the protection of biodiversity. And this convention has been ratified by, correct me if I'm wrong, by all the countries that were represented here, the Convention on Biological Diversity. And then we have the Paris Agreement that marks a common goal of states and nations to address climate change. And this calls on social inclusion when taking actions to address climate change. And it demands for the respect, promotion, and consideration of the rights of indigenous peoples, local communities, migrants, children, women, other vulnerable groups. It also recognizes the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples and local communities in climate change adaptation and mitigation. So there are numerous international agreements and instruments and resolutions that protect and promote indigenous people's rights and recognize their contribution, the contribution that they bring in addressing climate change. But we don't have to discuss all of this, but maybe it would be good to look at the regional level, at the legal framework at the regional level, Africa. Where is? So at the regional level, the African Charter, there you go. The African Charter on Human People's Rights include people's or mention people's rights. And this has been always interpreted to include indigenous people's rights. It has also established the African Commission on Human and People's Rights that has developed groundbreaking jurisprudence on the rights of indigenous peoples. And under this commission, we have the working group of experts on indigenous peoples and communities, which is a further manifestation of the recognition of indigenous peoples' rights in the region and the intent to address the historical discrimination and marginalization against them. The Republic of Congo, there are also at the national level legal frameworks protecting indigenous people's rights. For example, the Republic of Congo, I think, was the first African country to adopt a specific law on the promotion and protection of the rights of indigenous peoples. Kenya's constitution recognizes historically marginalized groups, which includes indigenous peoples. The DRC has recently passed a law in relation to indigenous people's rights. On the other hand, the term local communities, it does not have a legal definition under international law. There's no legal understanding of this term, but we often see the words indigenous peoples, local communities, but there is no really clear definition of this term, local communities. So for our conversation here, when we are talking about local communities, we'll be referring to those communities who are affected by the REDD+ projects, but who do not identify as indigenous peoples. But we have to emphasize that there is the distinct characteristic of indigenous peoples, the distinct rights, collective rights, that may not attach to local communities. Okay, so how about gender? How do we understand what does gender mean? So I'd like to call on Beth online for gender. Okay.
Thanks so much, Manja. Quickly before we go,
I'd just like to mention six important points. First, indigenous peoples possess valuable traditional knowledge about forest ecosystems and sustainable land management resources. And this knowledge is often crucial for the success and ecological soundness of REDD+ projects. Second, indigenous communities often have customary rights to their ancestral lands, including their forests, and recognizing and respecting these vital rights are important to avoid conflicts. And it's also important to ensure legal and ethical compliance and also to promote long-term sustainability in REDD+ initiatives. And then third, integrating indigenous perspectives ensures that the REDD+ projects do not worsen existing inequalities. On the other hand, it will promote social justice by acknowledging indigenous people's rights and ensuring that they benefit from conservation efforts rather than being marginalized or displaced by conservation initiatives or REDD+ projects. And then fourth, forests hold deep cultural, spiritual, and social significance for many indigenous communities. And including the indigenous people's perspectives ensures that REDD+ initiatives respect and preserve these cultural values, fostering a more holistic approach to forest conservation and therefore avoiding deforestation and destruction. And then fifth, the projects that are actively involved or actively involving indigenous communities tend to be more effective and sustainable. Their participation increases the legitimacy and acceptability of the RED Plus initiatives, which leads to better community engagement, cooperation, and long-term success. And then sixth, integrating indigenous perspectives aligns with international commitments to human rights and also to biodiversity conservation. So it ensures that RED Plus contributes to global climate goals while also delivering local, socio-economic, and environmental benefits. So in summary, we cannot talk about forests without the full, effective, and meaningful engagement and participation of the people whose values and way of life have resulted to the protection of the world's ecosystems. And this includes indigenous peoples, the local communities there, and the women and children in these populations. So these reasons that Beth and I mentioned apply to other policies as well, not just to the RED Plus. Other policies relating to environment, climate, and nature. This includes, of course, to the nationally determined contributions, the NBSOPs, which are both undergoing revisions and enhancements this year because they are due to submission again next year. And we also have the long-term strategies which are being developed by some countries, and I hope that the other countries will also consider developing. And we also have the carbon markets, which is an increasingly important topic at the country and the local level. So with this, let's see, do we have any questions? We have tackled our common understanding on what is social inclusion, who are indigenous peoples, what is gender equality and equity, and why is it important to include indigenous peoples, local communities, and gender in RED Plus initiatives. So we have a question at the back. Yes, please go ahead. One country, there are also several layers of differences. So that's why it is so diverse, as we said, that there is no single definition to say who are indigenous peoples. The second one is in relation to the term. Of course, indigenous, the term indigenous, this is a Western international word. Even for us, for example, in the Philippines, we have more than 100 ethno-linguistic groups. We call all these 100 ethno-linguistic groups by more than 1,000 different names. They have more than 1,000 different names. Although there is a law on indigenous peoples and they are collectively known as indigenous peoples, but of course we have our own local terms of how we call them. And this should of course be recognized. But it doesn't mean to say that we don't have the rights of indigenous peoples because we're calling ourselves by our own local terms. And third, regardless of whether these are indigenous peoples or local communities in RED Plus initiatives in forest conservation, they should be put at the heart of initiatives and programs. And they should not be left behind. No one should be left behind. Their inclusion and their rights should be respected and promoted, however terms or identification that they have for themselves. So I think that is what is more important, that what we are emphasizing here, however, that is for indigenous peoples, there are laws, both international, regional, and as well as at the national level, laws and policies that protect them and that ensures their inclusion and the respect of their rights. For local communities, they're considered as more general, their rights under a more general members of society. So there are questions or reactions in relation to gender. I'll turn it over to Beth.
Thanks so much, Manja.